Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and explore the sweeping, dramatic story of how a fractured collection of Celtic tribes transformed into the highly centralized modern Republic of France. If you've ever wondered how a nation actually builds a unified identity out of centuries of war, revolution, and shifting borders, you are definitely in the right place. To make sense of over 2 millennia of history, we're going to break it all down into 4 massive eras: foundations of the nation, rise of absolute monarchy, revolution and the empire, and finally, world wars and modernity. Throughout all of this, we'll be tracking the intense historical push and pull between regional fragmentation and the relentless centralizing power of Paris.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Foundations of the Nation. This is the messy, fascinating journey from ancient settlements right up to a medieval kingdom.
So, early France? Incredibly messy. We start with the Greeks settling on the Mediterranean coast around 600 BC in places like modern-day Marseille. Then you have the scattered Celtic tribes known as the Gauls. Despite this fierce resistance led by Vercingetorix, the Gauls were eventually defeated by Julius Caesar's Roman legions at Alesia in 52 BC. Gaul was integrated into the Roman Empire, which created this really interesting blended Gallo-Roman culture. Centuries later, as Rome began to fall, Germanic tribes swept in, bringing us to major figures like Clovis I and Charlemagne. The crucial takeaway here is the Franks. They literally laid the administrative and religious groundwork for the nation. Clovis I united most of Gaul and adopted Catholicism, which gave him massive legitimacy. Later on, Charlemagne expanded this into a huge empire, crowned by the Pope in 800 AD. But, empires fall apart. After Charlemagne, the region split and plunged into a highly decentralized, fragmented feudal state where local regional princes and barons held just as much practical power as the king himself.
Now, what's really wild is how the devastating 100 Years' War against England actually forced the French nobility to get their act together. You've got this massive succession crisis between the houses of Valois and Plantagenet. Out of all this incredible suffering, and through the sheer inspiration of a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, who became an absolute national heroine, we see the very first awakenings of true French nationalism. To actually fight off the English, King Charles VII had to establish the first French standing army. Survival literally required unity.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rise of Absolute Monarchy. This is where we see the French crown aggressively pulling all that power back to the center. These centuries mark a dramatic climb out of those feudal squabbles into a period of unmatched royal dominance, known as the Ancien Regime. After the 100 Years' War, the state really began consolidating. They survived the brutal French wars of religion in the 16th century, which was finally calmed down by the Edict of Nantes, and that paved the way for the ultimate centralization of the state. By the year 1700, get this, a staggering 20 million people lived in France. To put that into perspective, they had the second largest population in all of Europe at the time. That massive demographic edge absolutely fueled the wealth, the military might, and the cultural dominance of the French monarchy on the global stage.
And the main architect of all that? Louis XIV, the Sun King. He had this brilliant strategy to control his potential rivals. He literally forced the noble elite to live under his watchful eye at the spectacularly lavish Palace of Versailles. He completely wiped out the era of powerful independent barons by trapping them in this elaborate web of pensions and privileges, basically shifting all absolute decision-making power directly to himself.
But absolute power breeds absolute resentment. Which brings us to Section 3, Revolution and the Empire, a fiery paradigm shift that shocked the entire world. The historical whiplash of this era is just incredible, driven by a financial crisis, widespread distress, and the intellectual sparks of the Enlightenment. The people revolted. In just 15 short years, 15! France violently tore down its absolute monarchy, weathered the horrific reign of terror where thousands faced the guillotine, and then totally pivoted to crown a brilliant military general named Napoleon Bonaparte as emperor.
The sheer contrast before and after the revolution is staggering. On one side, you have the Ancien Regime, rigid social estates, feudal privileges, and the church holding massive wealth. On the other side, the Enlightenment ideals completely shattered that old system. The new First Republic abolished feudalism, stripped the church of its vast lands, and brought in these radical new concepts of civil liberty and equality before the law.
Now, while Napoleon is mostly famous for his military conquests across Europe, his most permanent legacy is actually the Napoleonic Code. He didn't just conquer territory, he cemented the revolution's core values into a clear, standardized legal framework. It officially threw out the old inheritance laws, set up a meritocracy, and crucially, it was administered uniformly by powerful prefects appointed from Paris. So once again, all true administrative power shifted right back to the capital.
But things took a dramatic turn. After his disastrous invasion of Russia and his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was exiled to a remote island. And it left France with a massive identity crisis. I mean, what do you do when your absolute monarch is gone, your republic ended in a bloodbath, and your emperor has just been banished?
Well, what followed was a dizzying blur of regime changes. Just look at this 19th century roller coaster. They spent decades bouncing back and forth, restoring the Bourbon kings, tossing them out for a constitutional monarchy, trying a short-lived Second Republic, falling under the authoritarian rule of Napoleon's nephew in the Second Empire, before finally, after a catastrophic war with Prussia, stabilizing into the Third Republic. Despite all that political chaos, it was also a time of massive industrialization and global colonial expansion.
That leaves us to our final era, Section 4, World Wars and Modernity. This is where modern France is truly forged in the incredibly harsh crucible of global conflict.
The 20th century violently tested the very foundations of the Third Republic. The nation was pushed to its absolute limits through two devastating world wars, a dark period of foreign occupation, and the incredibly painful dismantling of its overseas colonial empire.
3.4 million. That is the devastating number of French lives lost, including civilians, in the First World War. The Western Front was largely fought right on French soil, defined by that muddy, bloody stalemate of trench warfare in places like Verdun and the Somme. The physical, financial, and psychological damage to the nation was nearly incalculable.
Traumatized by that war, France built the Maginot Line, a massive, supposedly impenetrable series of border defenses. But sadly, it just wasn't enough. By World War II, the French defensive strategy failed completely against the German blitzkrieg. By pushing rapidly through the Ardennes forest, German forces completely bypassed those defenses, leading to the astonishing and humiliating conquest of France in just 6 weeks.
During the dark years of the occupation, French identity was severely fractured. On one side, you had the Vichy regime in the south, an authoritarian government that actively collaborated with Nazi Germany. On the other side, you had the resistance, incredibly brave underground fighters running sabotage missions within France alongside the Free French forces led by General Charles de Gaulle, broadcasting hope from exile over in London.
Emerging from the ashes of World War II, France had to reinvent itself all over again. First, they navigated a deeply painful decolonization process, fighting grueling wars in a failed bid to keep control of Indochina and Algeria. To prevent a civil war during the Algerian crisis, Charles de Gaulle was actually brought back to power. He established the highly resilient Fifth Republic in 1958, anchored by a very strong presidency. And finally, recognizing the absolute necessity for peace and economic strength, France became a central pillar of the modern European Union.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question. When you look at the whole sweep of this explainer, from scattered Celtic tribes fighting off Romans to the absolute control of the Sun King, right through the fires of revolution and 2 world wars, it's clear that French identity is never static. It's a story of constant, dramatic reinvention. So as France faces new economic shifts and cultural tensions today, how will that identity evolve next? How will the balance between a strong central state and a diverse modern population play out in the 21st century? It is absolutely something to keep an eye on.